Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. While her three older brothers argued loudly at the dinner table about sports and school, she sat silently, cutting her food into perfect squares. Her father, a retired Marine sergeant, often forgot she was there until her mother reminded him to ask about her day. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet tall with shoulder-length brown hair that she kept tied back in a simple ponytail. Her voice was so soft that teachers had to lean forward to hear her answers in class. Students at Jefferson High School knew her as the girl who sat in the back corner of every classroom, never raising her hand unless directly called upon. The Martinez family lived in a small town outside Fort Carson, Colorado, where military families were common. Sarah's father, Miguel, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a sniper before retiring due to a leg injury. He kept his service rifle locked away in a gun safe, along with medals he never talked about. The walls of their garage were covered with shooting trophies from his younger days, gathering dust behind old Christmas decorations. Sarah had grown up hearing stories about her father's military service from neighbors and family friends, but Miguel himself rarely spoke about those days. When people asked him about his time overseas, he would change the subject or walk away. The only hint of his past came during family camping trips, when he would point out distant landmarks and estimate their exact distance with uncanny accuracy. One evening in late October, Sarah overheard her parents talking in the kitchen after her brothers had gone to their rooms. Her mother, Elena, was worried about college expenses. Even with Miguel's disability benefits and Elena's job at the local hospital, money was tight. Sarah's grades were excellent, but they weren't sure how to pay for the education she deserved. Maybe she could try for a shooting scholarship, Miguel said quietly. Some colleges offer them for competitive shooting teams. Elena laughed, not unkindly. Miguel, Sarah has never even touched a gun. She's afraid of loud noises, remember? She still covers her ears during thunderstorms. Sarah pressed herself against the hallway wall, listening. It was true. She had always been sensitive to loud sounds. Fireworks made her anxious, and she wore headphones during action movies. The idea of shooting seemed impossible for someone like her. But something about the conversation stuck in her mind. That weekend, while her family was busy with various activities, Sarah quietly approached her father's study. She found his old shooting manuals and began reading about marksmanship, ballistics, and precision shooting. The technical aspects fascinated her. The mathematics of wind calculation, the physics of bullet trajectory, the mental discipline required for consistent accuracy. When Miguel discovered her reading his manuals 2 weeks later, he was surprised. Sarah looked up at him with curious eyes and asked, "Dad, could you teach me about shooting?" Miguel sat down heavily in his chair, studying his youngest daughter's face. "Why would you want to learn that, mija?" "I've been reading about it," she said softly. "It seems like it requires a lot of patience and focus. I think I might be good at those things." Miguel was quiet for a long moment. His daughter had always been different from her brothers, more thoughtful, more deliberate in everything she did. While the boys rushed through homework and chores, Sarah took her time, always producing careful, precise work. "Shooting isn't like the movies, Sarah. It's not about being tough or aggressive. The best shooters I knew were quiet people who could control their breathing and their minds." "Like me?" she asked. Miguel looked at his daughter's earnest face and made a decision that would change everything. "We'll start with the basics. Safety first always, and if you don't like it, we stop immediately." The following Saturday morning, Miguel took Sarah to an indoor shooting range, 30 minutes from their house. She wore oversized ear protection and safety glasses that made her look even smaller than usual. Other shooters glanced at them curiously, the grizzled veteran and the tiny teenage girl who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Miguel started her with a .22 caliber rifle, the smallest he could find. Sarah's hand shook as she held it for the first time, and she flinched when other shooters fired their weapons. But when Miguel showed her how to line up the sights and control her breathing, something clicked. Her first shot missed the target completely. The second went wide to the left. Miguel patiently corrected her stance and grip, speaking in the calm, instructional tone he had once used with new recruits. Sarah listened carefully to every word, asking questions about trigger pressure and sight alignment. By her 5th shot, she had hit the outer ring of the target. By her 10th, she was consistently hitting the scoring area. Miguel watched in amazement as his daughter's natural steadiness began to show. While other shooters struggled with consistency, Sarah's shots formed tight groups on the paper target. "Dad," she said quietly after firing her 20th round, "I think I understand why you were good at this." Miguel felt a strange mixture of pride and concern. His daughter had shown more natural ability in one session than most people developed in months of practice. But he also knew where this path could lead, and the weight it could put on someone's shoulders. As they packed up their equipment, Sarah asked, "Can we come back next week?" Miguel nodded, but that night he lay awake thinking about his quiet daughter and the unexpected talent she had revealed. He had spent years trying to leave his military past behind, but now it seemed like that past was calling to the next generation in the most unlikely way possible. Sarah fell asleep that night with her ears still ringing slightly from the shooting range, but her mind was clear and focused in a way it had never been before. She had found something she was naturally good at, something that made perfect sense to her methodical, patient personality. Neither of them could have imagined that this first tentative step would eventually lead to a shot that would be talked about for years to come, or that the quiet girl who was afraid of thunderstorms would one day silence a room full of doubters with a single, impossible demonstration of skill. 3 months into her shooting journey, Sarah had become a regular at Rocky Mountain Precision Range. The owner, Tom Bradley, had started greeting her by name and always made sure Lane 7 was available, the spot where she felt most comfortable. Her improvement had been remarkable, but what impressed people most was her methodical approach to every aspect of shooting. While other shooters would fire quickly through boxes of ammunition, Sarah took detailed notes in a small notebook. She recorded weather conditions, her emotional state, the exact ammunition type, and the results of every session. Miguel watched his daughter transform from a nervous beginner into someone who approached shooting like a science experiment. "She's got something special," Tom told Miguel one Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was cleaning her rifle with the same careful attention she gave to her homework. "I've been running this range for 20 years, and I've never seen someone progress this fast while being so systematic about it." Sarah had also begun to overcome her sensitivity to noise. She still wore double ear protection, but she no longer flinched when other shooters fired. Instead, she had learned to use the sounds of the range as information, identifying different calibers by their reports and timing her shots between other people's firing sequences. At home, Sarah had convinced her parents to let her set up a small study area focused on marksmanship theory. She borrowed books from the library about ballistics, meteorology, and competitive shooting. Her brothers teased her about becoming obsessed with gun stuff, but they fell silent when she began helping them with math homework, using trajectory calculations as practical examples. Her shooting scores had progressed from beginner level to intermediate faster than anyone expected. Miguel began bringing her to the outdoor range on the other side of town, where she could practice at longer distances. Sarah's first 200-yard shot took her 15 minutes to set up. She checked wind conditions with a small weather meter Miguel had bought her, adjusted her scope with tiny, precise movements, and practiced her breathing pattern several times before taking the shot. The bullet struck within 2 inches of the bullseye. Miguel tried to hide his amazement, but Tom, who had driven out to watch Sarah's progression to longer ranges, let out a low whistle. "Miguel, you need to enter her in some competitions," Tom said. "There's a regional precision shooting match coming up in Denver next month. She's ready for it." Sarah looked up from her spotting scope where she had been analyzing her shot placement. "I don't think I'm ready for that. I've only been shooting for 3 months. Mija," Miguel said gently. "Some people shoot for years and never develop the consistency you have." "Tom's right. You should try competing." The idea terrified Sarah. Speaking up in class was difficult enough. The thought of shooting in front of strangers and judges seemed impossible. But that night, she researched competitive shooting online and found herself drawn to the technical challenges and the emphasis on precision over speed. The Rocky Mountain Regional Precision Match was held on a crisp November morning at a range outside Denver. Sarah arrived with Miguel, carrying her father's old rifle case and wearing a borrowed shooting jacket that was too big for her small frame. The other competitors were mostly men in their 30s and 40s, many of them veterans or law enforcement officers who had been shooting competitively for decades. Sarah signed up for the novice division, but the match director, after looking at her age and slight build, suggested she might want to start with the youth category instead. "It might be less intimidating, honey," he said with a patronizing smile. Miguel started to object, but Sarah touched his arm. The novice division is fine, she said quietly. That's what I am. The competition consisted of 4 stages: 100-yard precision, 200-yard precision, 300-yard precision, and a challenging 400-yard stage that many novice shooters skipped entirely. Sarah watched the other competitors carefully, noting their techniques and equipment. Many of them had expensive custom rifles with advanced optics, while she was using her father's modified military surplus rifle. When Sarah's turn came for the 100-yard stage, conversations around the firing line gradually died down. The tiny girl with the oversized equipment looked completely out of place among the experienced shooters. Some of the competitors exchanged amused glances, expecting her to struggle. Sarah took her time setting up just as she did at the range. She adjusted her position multiple times, checked her scope settings, and went through her breathing routine. The time limit for the stage was 15 minutes. Sarah used 12 of them for preparation and took her 5 required shots in the final 3 minutes. All 5 shots landed within a 3-inch group, centered on the bullseye. It was the best score in the novice division so far, but Sarah seemed more focused on analyzing what she could have done better than celebrating her success. The 200-yard stage went similarly. Sarah's methodical approach contrasted sharply with the other shooters' more casual attitudes. While they chatted between shots and fired relatively quickly, Sarah treated each shot like it was the only one that mattered. Her score was again the highest in her division. By the 300-yard stage, word had spread among the competitors about the quiet teenager who was dominating the novice division. A small crowd gathered to watch as Sarah set up for her longest competitive shots yet. The wind had picked up, making conditions more challenging. Sarah spent extra time reading the wind flags and grass movement. She made several small adjustments to her scope and changed her aiming point slightly to compensate for the crosswind. When she finally began shooting, each shot was followed by a long pause as she reset her position and breathing. 4 of her 5 shots landed within 2 inches of the bullseye. The 5th shot, affected by a sudden wind gust, was still well within the scoring area. Her combined score for 3 stages was not only the best in the novice division, but would have placed her 3rd in the expert division. "She's sandbagging," muttered one of the older competitors. "No way someone shoots like that after 3 months." Miguel overheard the comment and felt his jaw tighten, but Sarah seemed oblivious to the growing attention. She was focused entirely on the final stage, the 400-yard challenge that would test the limits of her equipment and her developing skills. Most of the novice competitors had skipped this stage, considering it too difficult. Even some of the experienced shooters struggled with the distance and wind conditions. Sarah studied the target through her spotting scope for several minutes, making calculations in her notebook. "You don't have to do this stage, mija," Miguel said. "You've already won your division." Sarah looked up at her father with the same determined expression she wore when tackling difficult homework problems. "I want to see if I can do it," she said simply. As Sarah prepared for her longest competitive shots, the crowd around the firing line grew larger. Word had spread that the small girl in the oversized jacket was shooting scores that defied explanation. Even the match officials had gathered to watch. Sarah took nearly 10 minutes to set up for the 400-yard stage, making tiny adjustments and checking conditions repeatedly. When she finally settled into her shooting position, the entire range fell silent. Everyone present understood they were about to witness something special, though none of them could have predicted just how remarkable Sarah's performance would be. Sarah's first shot at 400 yards sailed wide to the right. She had miscalculated the wind, something that had never happened to her before. The miss drew a few knowing nods from the experienced shooters. This was where reality would set in for the overachieving teenager. But Sarah didn't seem discouraged. She made careful notes in her book, adjusted her scope, and waited for the wind to stabilize. Her second shot was closer, hitting the outer edge of the scoring area. Still not good enough by her standards. Miguel watched his daughter's face and recognized the expression, the same look she wore when struggling with a particularly difficult math problem. Sarah wasn't seeing failure. She was seeing data to analyze and improve upon. Her third shot was better, landing in the 8 ring. The crowd murmured approvingly, but Sarah was frowning slightly. She was learning the wind patterns at this new distance, and each shot was teaching her something valuable. Shot 4 landed in the 9 ring, just missing the bullseye. The improvement was dramatic and obvious to everyone watching. Sarah's ability to adapt and learn in real time was becoming clear to the experienced shooters who had initially dismissed her. For her final shot, Sarah took even more time. She observed the wind flags, watched the grass movement, and made one final tiny adjustment to her scope. When she fired, the shot felt different, perfectly smooth and controlled. The spotter called out, "X-ring center." A perfect bullseye that would have been impressive for any shooter, let alone someone in their first competition. Sarah won the novice division by a margin that shocked everyone present. Her combined score would have placed her second overall in the expert division, behind only the state champion who had been shooting competitively for 15 years. During the award ceremony, Sarah stood quietly while the match director praised her performance. When asked to say a few words, she simply thanked her father for teaching her and said she looked forward to learning more. The other competitors applauded, but many were still trying to process what they had witnessed. On the drive home, Miguel was unusually quiet. Finally, he said, "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What you did today, that's not normal. People are going to start paying attention to you now." Sarah looked out the window at the passing landscape. "Is that bad?" "Not bad, but different. There will be pressure. People will have expectations." Within a week, Sarah's performance had spread through the local shooting community. Tom at the range was fielding calls from coaches, equipment sponsors, and shooting programs at various colleges. Sarah found herself simultaneously excited and overwhelmed by the attention. The first real test came 2 weeks later when a retired Army shooting coach named Robert Chen visited the range specifically to evaluate Sarah. Chen had trained Olympic competitors and worked with military snipers. He had driven 4 hours from Colorado Springs after hearing about Sarah's competition performance. "I need to see this for myself," Chen told Miguel. "The scores you're telling me about aren't possible for someone with 3 months of experience." Sarah was nervous about being evaluated, but she agreed to demonstrate her shooting. Chen brought his own rifle and ammunition, wanting to eliminate any variables that might explain her performance. He set up targets at 100, 200, and 300 yards, and Sarah's first group at 100 yards measured less than 1 inch. Precision that impressed even Chen. At 200 yards, she maintained accuracy that many competitive shooters couldn't match, but it was at 300 yards that Chen realized he was seeing something truly exceptional. Sarah fired 5 shots that could be covered by a quarter. Chen examined the target through his spotting scope and shook his head in amazement. "This is the kind of shooting I expect from someone with years of training and thousands of dollars in custom equipment." After the session, Chen sat down with Sarah and Miguel. "Sarah, I want to invite you to train with my advanced group. These are college-level shooters and military veterans. You'd be the youngest by at least 5 years." Sarah looked uncertain. "Would they want someone like me there?" "Someone like you is exactly what competitive shooting needs," Chen said. "You have natural ability that can't be taught, combined with a work ethic and analytical mind that most shooters never develop." Sarah agreed to attend one training session with Chen's group the following weekend. She arrived at the Colorado Springs range to find a dozen serious-looking shooters preparing for practice. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 40s, and all of them had expensive custom rifles and professional-grade equipment. The group's leader, a former Marine named Jake Morrison, looked skeptical when Chen introduced Sarah. "She's pretty young. Coach, you sure she's ready for this level?" "Let her shoot first, then judge," Chen replied. The training session began with a challenging drill, 10 shots at 300 yards with a 2-minute time limit. It was designed to test both accuracy and speed under pressure. The experienced shooters completed the drill with various levels of success, most achieving respectable scores but nothing exceptional. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the firing line with her usual methodical preparation. Several of the group members exchanged glances, clearly thinking she was taking too much time. Sarah completed the drill with 8 seconds to spare and achieved the highest score of the day. More importantly, her shots were grouped tighter than anyone else's, indicating superior consistency under pressure. Jake Morrison examined Sarah's target and whistled softly. "Okay, I'm convinced. That's some seriously good shooting," but not everyone in the group was ready to accept Sarah. During the break, she overheard 2 of the older shooters discussing her performance. "There's no way that's natural talent," one said. "I've been shooting for 12 years and I can't shoot groups like that." Maybe her dad's been training her longer than they're saying, replied the other. Nobody gets that good that fast. The comment stung, but Sarah tried to focus on what Chen was teaching the group about advanced wind reading techniques. She took careful notes and asked thoughtful questions, just as she always did. The real test came during the session's final exercise, a 400-yard shot at a challenging target in variable wind conditions. This was the kind of shot that separated serious competitive shooters from casual enthusiasts. One by one, the group members took their attempts. Some hit the target, others missed entirely. The wind was shifting unpredictably, making it extremely difficult to judge the correct hold-off. Sarah watched each shooter carefully, noting how they read the wind and where their shots landed. She was learning from their successes and mistakes, building a mental database of information about shooting in these conditions. When her turn came, Sarah spent longer than usual preparing. The wind was particularly tricky, shifting direction every few seconds. She waited for a pattern she could predict and made her shot during a brief lull. The bullet struck the target dead center. It was a shot that impressed even the most experienced members of the group and silenced any remaining doubts about her abilities. After the session, Jake Morrison approached Sarah privately. "Look, I owe you an apology. I judged you before seeing what you could do. That 400-yard shot was perfect." Sarah smiled shyly. "Thank you. I'm still learning a lot." "Keep that attitude," Jake said. "It's what's going to make you dangerous in competitions." As Sarah packed her equipment, Chen pulled Miguel aside. "She needs to start competing at the state level. There's a championship match next month that could qualify her for nationals. She's ready for it." Miguel looked at his daughter, who was carefully cleaning her rifle with the same attention to detail she brought to everything. "What do you think, Mija? Are you ready for bigger competitions?" Sarah looked up from her cleaning. "I think I'd like to try." Neither of them realized that this decision would soon put Sarah on a path toward a shot that would define her reputation forever, and that her next competition would present challenges far greater than anything she had faced so far. The Colorado State Precision Championship was held at a sprawling range complex outside Pueblo, where competitors would face distances up to 1,000 yards. Sarah had never attempted a shot beyond 400 yards, but Chen assured her that her fundamentals were solid enough to handle the challenge. The competition drew shooters from across the region, including several who competed at the national level. Sarah arrived to find herself surrounded by equipment that cost more than her family's car. Custom rifles with advanced optics, specialized shooting rests, and electronic wind meters that provided real-time atmospheric data. During registration, Sarah overheard conversations that made her stomach tighten with nervousness. These shooters talked casually about international competitions, sponsorship deals, and shooting techniques that sounded impossibly advanced. She began to wonder if Chen had pushed her into competition beyond her abilities. The first day consisted of shorter-range precision stages to establish baseline scores. Sarah performed well at 300 and 400 yards, but her scores were no longer dramatically superior to the other competitors. The gap between her natural talent and their years of experience was becoming apparent. "Don't worry about the scores today," Chen told her after the first day's competition. "Tomorrow's long-range stages are where your patience and analytical approach will give you an advantage. Most of these shooters rely too heavily on technology and not enough on reading conditions." That evening, Sarah studied meteorology websites and wind charts until late into the night. She had learned that successful long-range shooting was as much about understanding atmospheric conditions as it was about marksmanship fundamentals. The second day began with the 600-yard stage. Sarah had practiced this distance only a few times and never in competition conditions. The morning air was still and clear, but experienced shooters warned that conditions would become more challenging as the day heated up. Sarah's first group at 600 yards was respectable, but not exceptional. She was learning how her rifle performed at extended ranges and how to read the subtle signs of bullet trajectory at distances, where gravity and air resistance became significant factors. The 800-yard stage proved more challenging. Several experienced shooters struggled with the distance and swirling wind conditions. Sarah's methodical approach served her well. She took extensive notes between each shot, tracking how different wind conditions affected bullet impact. By the final shot of the 800-yard stage, Sarah had adapted to the conditions well enough to place a shot in the 9 ring. It wasn't perfect, but it demonstrated her ability to learn and adjust under pressure. The 1,000-yard stage was scheduled for the afternoon, after lunch break. This was the championship's signature challenge, a distance that tested every aspect of a shooter's skill and equipment. Many competitors had spent years working up to consistent accuracy at this range. During lunch, Sarah sat quietly with Miguel and Chen, reviewing her notes from the morning stages. She had filled several pages with observations about wind patterns, temperature effects, and how her rifle's point of impact changed at different distances. The 1,000-yard target is going to look impossibly small, Chen warned her. Your scope will barely show detail. You'll need to trust your calculations and your fundamentals completely. Sarah nodded, but privately she was intimidated by the prospect. 1,000 yards was nearly 6/10 of a mile, a distance that seemed almost theoretical until she walked down range during the lunch break and saw how tiny the targets looked. When the 1,000-yard stage began, Sarah watched other shooters carefully. Many of them used advanced ballistic computers and electronic wind meters, inputting data and making calculations that seemed impossibly complex. Their equipment costs alone exceeded what most families spent on cars. The first few shooters achieved mixed results. Some missed the target entirely, while others managed hits in the outer scoring rings. The wind conditions were challenging but not impossible, steady enough for consistent shooting but variable enough to require careful reading. When Sarah's turn arrived, she felt more nervous than she had since her first competition. The target looked impossibly small through her scope, and she was acutely aware of the experienced shooters watching her performance. Sarah took her time setting up just as she always did. She checked wind conditions multiple times and made careful calculations in her notebook. The other shooters had sophisticated electronic aids, but Sarah relied on her observations of grass movement, flag positions, and the feeling of wind on her face. Her first shot at 1,000 yards missed the target completely. The impact was visible in the dirt bank behind the target, but Sarah had misjudged the bullet drop at this extreme distance. She made notes about the miss and adjusted her scope accordingly. The second shot struck the outer edge of the target, technically a scoring hit, but far from the precision Sarah expected from herself. She was learning that 1,000-yard shooting required a completely different level of calculation and environmental awareness. For her third shot, Sarah spent several minutes recalculating her ballistic data. She had been using generic formulas, but each rifle behaved slightly differently at extreme ranges. She needed to determine her specific rifle's characteristics through trial and error. Shot 3 landed in the 7 ring. Better, but still not competitive with the top shooters. Sarah was beginning to understand why long-range shooting was considered one of the most challenging precision sports. The margin for error was measured in fractions of inches in scope adjustment, but resulted in feet of difference at the target. Her fourth shot, benefiting from the data she had gathered from previous attempts, struck the 8 ring. The improvement was noticeable, and several experienced shooters nodded approvingly. They recognized the learning process happening in real time. For her final shot, Sarah took even more time than usual. She had learned her rifle's behavior at this distance and had a better understanding of the wind conditions. More importantly, she had stopped being intimidated by the distance and started treating it like any other shooting problem to solve. The 5th shot struck the 9 ring, just missing the bullseye. It was a significant improvement from her first attempt and demonstrated her ability to adapt to new challenges. While not the best score of the day, it was respectable for someone shooting 1,000 yards for the first time in competition. Sarah finished the state championship in 5th place overall, an impressive result for her first major competition, though not the dominant performance she had achieved at local events. More importantly, she had proven she could compete at the state level and continue improving. During the awards ceremony, the match director made a special mention of Sarah's performance. We had a young shooter here today who had never attempted 1,000-yard shots before this competition. Her improvement throughout the day was remarkable and shows the dedication that competitive shooting requires. After the ceremony, several experienced shooters approached Sarah to offer encouragement and advice. They recognized her potential and understood that her 5th place finish was actually more impressive than the victories of shooters with years more experience. "Keep working," said Linda Patterson, the women's state champion. You have something special. With more experience at these distances, you could be dangerous in national-level competition. On the drive home, Sarah was quiet for most of the trip. Finally, she said, "Dad, I want to learn how to shoot even further distances." Some of those shooters talked about 1,500 and 2,000-yard competitions. Miguel glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. "That's extreme long-range shooting, Mija. It requires different equipment and techniques. Are you sure you want to go down that path?" "I think I do," Sarah replied. "I want to see how far I can push myself." Neither of them knew that this conversation was setting Sarah on a path toward the most challenging shot of her life, one that would test not only her technical skills but her mental strength in ways she couldn't imagine. The lessons she had learned about patience, calculation, and perseverance at 1,000 yards would soon prove invaluable at distances that most shooters considered impossible. 6 months after the state championship, Sarah had transformed her approach to shooting entirely. Chen had connected her with Marcus Webb, a former military sniper who specialized in extreme long-range shooting. Webb ran a small training facility in Wyoming, where he taught advanced techniques to military contractors, law enforcement snipers, and the few civilian competitors who could afford his instruction. Webb's first assessment of Sarah was brutally honest. "You have excellent fundamentals and natural ability, but extreme long-range shooting is a completely different discipline. Everything you think you know about reading wind and calculating trajectory becomes 10 times more complex when you push beyond 1,200 yards." Sarah spent weekends at Webb's facility, learning about advanced ballistics software, atmospheric density changes, and the Coriolis effect, the way Earth's rotation affected bullet flight at extreme distances. The technical complexity was enormous, but Sarah approached it the same way she had approached her high school physics classes, methodically and with complete focus. Webb was impressed by Sarah's dedication to understanding the science behind long-range shooting. While many students wanted shortcuts and simple formulas, Sarah insisted on learning the underlying physics. She filled notebook after notebook with calculations, atmospheric data, and detailed observations about how different conditions affected bullet performance. "Most shooters want magic formulas," Webb told Miguel during one of Sarah's training sessions. "Your daughter wants to understand why the formulas work. That's what separates good long-range shooters from great ones." Sarah's shooting distances gradually extended as her understanding deepened. She progressed from 1,000 yards to 1,200, then 1,400. Each increase in distance brought new challenges, more complex wind calculations, greater effects from temperature and humidity changes, and the need for increasingly precise equipment adjustments. At 1,500 yards, Sarah encountered her first serious plateau. Despite perfect conditions and careful calculations, her shots were inconsistent. Some would strike close to the target center, while others would miss by several feet. The frustration was unlike anything she had experienced in her shooting journey. Webb recognized the problem immediately. "You're overthinking it now. At these distances, you can calculate perfectly and still miss if you don't trust your fundamentals. The mental game becomes as important as the technical knowledge." Sarah spent weeks working on the mental aspects of extreme long-range shooting. Webb taught her meditation techniques used by military snipers to maintain focus during long stalks and difficult shots. She learned to clear her mind of calculations and trust her preparation when it came time to fire. The breakthrough came during a training session in unusually challenging conditions. High winds and variable temperatures had made accurate shooting nearly impossible for most of the day. Sarah's first few attempts at 1,500 yards had been frustrating failures, but late in the afternoon, during a brief lull in the wind, Sarah achieved something that surprised even Webb. 5 consecutive shots at 1,500 yards, all within a 6-inch group centered on the target. It was shooting that would have been impressive at 600 yards, let alone more than double that distance. "Now you're beginning to understand what's possible," Webb said, examining the target through his spotting scope. "That's the kind of shooting that wins extreme long-range competitions." Word of Sarah's progress had begun to spread through the small community of extreme long-range shooters. Webb mentioned her performance to other instructors, and stories about the teenage girl who was mastering distances that challenged seasoned competitors began to circulate. The first real test came when Webb invited Sarah to attend the Western Extreme Long Range Championship in Nevada, a competition where distances extended to 2,000 yards and beyond. It was considered one of the most challenging precision shooting events in the country. "I don't think I'm ready for something that competitive," Sarah told Webb. "I've only been shooting long distances for a few months." "You're never ready until you try," Webb replied. "Besides, this competition has something special about it. There's a challenge shot at 2,500 yards that most competitors don't even attempt. It's more of a demonstration than a serious competition stage. But it's where reputations are made." Sarah agreed to compete, though she was intimidated by the prospect of shooting alongside some of the most accomplished, long-range shooters in the country. The competition would be held at a desert facility outside Las Vegas, where the flat terrain and clear air provided ideal conditions for extreme distance shooting. When Sarah arrived at the competition, she was overwhelmed by the level of equipment and expertise on display. Competitors had custom rifles worth tens of thousands of dollars, trailer-mounted shooting platforms, and support teams to help with calculations and spotting. Sarah felt out of place with her modified military surplus rifle and simple notebook system. The first day of competition included stages at 1,000, 1,200, and 1,500 yards. Sarah performed respectably but not exceptionally. Her scores placed her in the middle of the pack, good enough to avoid embarrassment but not competitive, with the top shooters who had been refining their techniques for decades. "Don't worry about the scores," Webb told her that evening. "You're learning what this level of competition requires. The experience is more valuable than any placing right now." The second day featured the signature 2,000-yard stage that gave the competition its reputation. Sarah had never attempted a shot at this distance even in practice. The target appeared as a tiny speck through her scope, and the ballistic calculations required were more complex than anything she had attempted. Sarah watched the first several shooters tackle the 2,000-yard challenge. Even the most experienced competitors struggled with the distance and desert wind conditions. Hits anywhere on the target were celebrated as significant achievements, and several shooters missed entirely despite their advanced equipment and years of experience. When Sarah's turn came, she spent nearly 15 minutes preparing for her first 2,000-yard attempt. She checked and rechecked her calculations, made multiple wind readings, and adjusted her scope settings several times. The other competitors watched with interest, curious to see how the young newcomer would handle the extreme distance. Her first shot missed the target by several feet, striking the dirt bank well to the right. Sarah made careful notes about the miss and adjusted her calculations. The wind at 2,000 yards was behaving differently than at shorter distances, and she was learning to read the multiple wind layers between her position and the target. Shot 2 was closer but still missed the target. Sarah was beginning to understand the complexity of 2,000-yard shooting. Every variable became magnified, and small errors in calculation or execution resulted in dramatic misses at the target. Her third attempt struck the outer edge of the target, technically a hit, but barely. Several competitors applauded the achievement, recognizing how difficult it was to connect at this distance. For Sarah, however, it was just data to help improve her next shot. The fourth shot landed closer to center, earning more appreciative comments from the watching shooters. Sarah's ability to learn and adapt in real time was becoming evident to everyone present. For her final shot at 2,000 yards, Sarah took even more time than before. She had learned from her previous attempts and had a better understanding of how conditions affected bullet flight. At this extreme distance, when she fired, the shot felt perfect. Smooth trigger press, natural follow-through, and complete confidence in her calculations. The spotter called out a hit in the 7 ring, near the center of the target. It was an impressive shot that earned genuine applause from the experienced competitors. More importantly for Sarah, it proved she could adapt to new challenges and perform under pressure. During the awards ceremony, the match director announced the optional challenge shot that had become legendary among long-range shooters. "Tomorrow morning we'll have the opportunity for anyone brave enough to attempt our 2,500-yard demonstration shot. It's not scored, and there's no prize except bragging rights. But it's become a tradition that separates the truly ambitious from the merely skilled." Sarah listened with interest as the match director explained the challenge. The 2,500-yard shot was considered nearly impossible under field conditions. Only a handful of shooters had ever connected at this distance in competition, and those successes had become legendary stories told throughout the long-range shooting community. That evening, Sarah approached Webb about attempting the challenge shot. "I know I'm not experienced enough to expect success, but I'd like to try." The experience would be valuable. Webb studied his student's face and recognized the same determination that had driven her rapid progress throughout her shooting journey. It's an extremely difficult shot, Sarah. The calculations alone are complex enough to challenge PhD-level physicists, and the margin for error is essentially zero. I understand, Sarah replied, but I want to see how far I can push myself. Webb nodded slowly. All right. We'll spend this evening working through the ballistic calculations and environmental factors. If we're going to attempt this, we'll do it right. They worked until late into the night, calculating trajectory data, analyzing weather forecasts, and planning every aspect of the attempt. Sarah filled page. The morning of the challenge shot dawned clear and still in the Nevada desert. Sarah woke before sunrise, her stomach tight with nervous energy. She had spent most of the night reviewing her calculations and visualizing the shot sequence, but now faced the reality of attempting something that had defeated dozens of more experienced shooters. At breakfast, conversations among the competitors centered around the challenge shot. Veterans of multiple extreme long-range competitions discussed previous attempts, sharing stories of near misses and spectacular failures. The consensus seemed to be that conditions would need to be perfect, and luck would play as large a role as skill. I've seen shooters with 30 years of experience miss that target by 50 yards, said Jim Richards, a former military sniper who had won the competition twice. The wind changes so much over that distance that your calculations are obsolete by the time the bullet gets halfway there. Sarah listened quietly to these conversations, taking mental notes about the challenges other shooters had faced. She was particularly interested in learning about wind, patterns at different times of day, and how atmospheric conditions changed as the desert heated up. Webb found Sarah studying her notebook over her barely touched breakfast. Second thoughts? He asked. No, Sarah replied. Just making sure I understand everything we calculated last night. I want to be completely prepared. The challenge shot was scheduled for mid-morning, when atmospheric conditions were typically most stable. As the time approached, word spread through the range that several shooters had signed up for attempts, including the young girl who had impressed everyone with her 2,000-yard performance the day before. 12 shooters ultimately decided to attempt the 2,500-yard challenge. Sarah was scheduled to shoot 8th, giving her the opportunity to observe how others approached the extreme distance and learn from their techniques and failures. The first shooter was Tom Chen, a computer engineer who had spent 5 years developing custom ballistic software for extreme long-range shooting. His equipment setup took nearly 20 minutes and included electronic wind meters at multiple positions between his shooting point and the target. Chen's first shot missed by an estimated 40 yards to the left. His sophisticated calculations had been undone by a wind shift that occurred during the bullet's 4-second flight time. He made adjustments and tried again, this time missing high by a similar margin. After 3 attempts, Chen packed up his equipment without achieving a hit. The wind is just too variable today, he announced. My software can't account for changes that happen during bullet flight. The next several shooters fared similarly. Equipment worth more than most people's cars failed to overcome the fundamental challenge of reading and predicting wind conditions across such an enormous distance. Shots that looked perfect through the scope missed the target by yards, victims of atmospheric conditions that changed during the bullet's lengthy journey. By the time Sarah's turn arrived, no one had successfully hit the 2,500-yard target. The accumulated failures had created an atmosphere of resigned acceptance among the spectators. The challenge shot was living up to its reputation as nearly impossible under field conditions. Sarah's equipment setup was notably simpler than the previous shooters. While others had deployed electronic instruments and computer systems, Sarah relied primarily on her notebook, a simple wind meter, and careful observation of natural indicators like grass movement and dust patterns. You sure you don't want to borrow some of our equipment? Offered Richards. This distance requires every advantage you can get. Sarah politely declined. She had learned to trust her ability to read conditions through observation and calculation, rather than relying heavily on electronic aids. Her approach was more intuitive and less dependent on technology that could malfunction or provide misleading information. Sarah spent 25 minutes preparing for her first attempt. She took wind readings at multiple intervals, noted the movement of vegetation at various distances, and calculated the effects of the slowly rising temperature on bullet trajectory. her notebook filled with observations and cross-reference calculations. The crowd of spectators had grown as word spread about the challenge attempts. Competitors who had finished their regular competition stages gathered to watch, along with range officials and guests. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something special, not because success was expected, but because the attempt itself required courage that few shooters possessed. When Sarah finally settled into her shooting position, the range fell silent. Her rifle looked almost primitive compared to the custom equipment used by previous shooters. But her setup process had been more thorough and methodical than anyone else's. Sarah's first shot at 2,500 yards disappeared into the distance, and the spotter called out a miss to the right by approximately 30 yards. It was actually one of the closer attempts of the day, but still far from the target. Sarah made careful notes about the shot and began planning adjustments. "Not bad for a first try," called out one of the spectators. "You were closer than half the guys who shot before you." Sarah acknowledged the comment with a nod but remained focused on her analysis. She had learned something important from the first shot about how wind conditions were affecting bullet flight at different points along the trajectory. Her second attempt incorporated lessons from the first shot. Sarah had adjusted her wind calculations based on where the first bullet had impacted, creating a more accurate picture of the atmospheric conditions along the bullet's path. The second shot was called as a miss low and left by approximately 20 yards. Still not a hit, but the correction from her first attempt had been significant. Sarah was systematically learning how to read the complex wind patterns across the enormous distance. "She's getting closer," Webb murmured to Miguel, who had been watching with increasing tension. "Her method is working." For her third attempt, Sarah spent even more time analyzing conditions. She had noticed a pattern in the wind shifts and was timing her shot to coincide with a period of relative stability. The calculations in her notebook had become increasingly complex as she factored in data from her previous attempts. The third shot struck the ground approximately 10 yards from the target, close enough that the dust cloud from the impact was clearly visible even at the extreme distance. A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd of spectators. Sarah was demonstrating the same learning ability that had characterized her entire shooting career, but now at a distance that challenged the limits of what was considered possible. "One more adjustment and she might actually hit it," said Richards, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine interest in Sarah's systematic approach. Sarah prepared for her fourth attempt with the same methodical care she had shown throughout her shooting career. She had learned from each previous shot and had developed an increasingly accurate understanding of the conditions affecting bullet flight across the 2,500-yard distance. The shot felt perfect as she squeezed the trigger, smooth, controlled, and executed with complete confidence in her calculations. The bullet disappeared into the distance, beginning its 4-second journey across the Nevada desert toward a target that looked impossibly small even through her scope. 4 seconds of absolute silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of impact. The spotter's voice cracked slightly as he made the call that would be remembered by everyone present. "Hit! Center target." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah had achieved something that had defeated dozens of more experienced shooters, connecting with a target at a distance that pushed the absolute limits of what was considered possible with conventional rifle shooting. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. She had one more shot remaining, and something in her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with simply achieving a hit. She wanted to prove that her success wasn't just luck, but the result of skill and preparation that could be repeated under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The celebration around Sarah's successful 2,500-yard hit gradually quieted as spectators realized she was preparing for another attempt. Most shooters would have been satisfied with achieving the single hit that had eluded so many others, but Sarah's expression showed the same focused determination that had driven her throughout her shooting journey. "You don't need to prove anything more," Webb said quietly. "That hit was incredible." Sarah looked up from her notebook, where she was analyzing the conditions that had made her fourth shot successful. "I want to see if I can do it again. If it was just luck, then I haven't really accomplished anything." The logic was unmistakably Sarah's, methodical, analytical, and focused on understanding rather than simply achieving. She had never been satisfied with single successes. She wanted to understand the principles that made success repeatable. The crowd of spectators had grown even larger as word spread throughout the range complex about the teenage girl who had connected at 2,500 yards. Shooters from other competitions had walked over to witness what was being called one of the most impressive shots in the history of extreme long-range shooting. Among the new spectators was David Harrison, a legendary figure in precision shooting, who had been competing at the national level for over 20 years. Harrison held multiple records and had trained Olympic shooters, but he had never successfully hit a target at 2,500 yards under competition conditions. "I've been trying to make that shot for 15 years, Harrison told the group of spectators. "If she can do it twice, she's operating on a level that very few people ever reach." Sarah was oblivious to the growing attention and the weight of expectation building around her final attempt. She remained focused on her preparation, analyzing every variable that could affect the shot and planning for contingencies that might arise. During the bullet's long flight to the target, the wind conditions had changed slightly since her successful shot, requiring new calculations and adjustments. Sarah spent nearly 30 minutes preparing for her final attempt, taking measurements and making observations with the same patience she had shown since her first day at the shooting range. "She's taking a lot of time," observed one of the spectators, a note of impatience in his voice. "She's being thorough," replied Harrison. "At this distance, rushing is guaranteed failure. She understands that preparation is everything." Sarah's preparation included factors that most shooters never considered. She noted the angle of the sun and how it might affect her scope's performance. She observed the flight patterns of birds in the distance, using them as indicators of air currents that couldn't be measured by ground-based instruments. She even factored in the rotation of the Earth, which became a significant variable at such extreme distances. When Sarah finally settled into her shooting position for the 5th time, the entire range had fallen silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic, not just because of the extreme difficulty of the shot, but because of the remarkable journey that had brought a quiet teenage girl to this moment. Sarah's breathing pattern was perfectly controlled as she aligned her scope and prepared to fire. The target was so distant that it appeared as barely more than a speck, even through her high-powered optic. Her calculations indicated that the bullet would take over 4 seconds to reach the target, during which time atmospheric conditions could change enough to cause a complete miss. The shot broke cleanly, with the smooth trigger control that had become Sarah's trademark. The bullet disappeared into the desert air, beginning its long arc toward the distant target. 4 seconds had never felt longer to the assembled spectators, who waited in complete silence for the result. The impact was visible even at the extreme distance, a small puff of dust that confirmed the bullet had struck the target area. The spotter's call came a moment later. "Hit! Dead center!" The reaction from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. Veteran shooters who had been competing for decades stood and applauded with genuine amazement. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, still processing what they had witnessed. Sarah had not only hit the 2,500-yard target twice, but had done so with increasing accuracy. Her final shot had struck the center of the target with precision that would have been impressive at 600 yards, let alone more than 4 times that distance. Harrison was the first to reach Sarah as she stood up from her shooting position. "In 30 years of competitive shooting, I have never seen anything like that," he said, extending his hand. "You just accomplished something that most of us consider impossible." The praise continued as other competitors gathered around Sarah, each expressing amazement at what they had witnessed. Stories of the 2 successful 2,500-yard shots would spread throughout the shooting community within hours, establishing Sarah's reputation at the highest levels of the sport. But perhaps the most meaningful reaction came from Webb, who had worked with Sarah for months and understood the dedication and analytical thinking that had made this moment possible. "You didn't just hit that target twice," he told her. "You proved that extreme long-range shooting is a science that can be mastered through study and practice. You've changed what people think is possible." The formal competition concluded with Sarah receiving a special recognition for her achievement. The match director announced that her performance would be recorded in the competition's record books as the first successful repetition of the 2,500-yard challenge shot. During the award ceremony, Sarah was asked to speak about her achievement. She stood quietly for a moment, then said in her characteristic soft voice, "I think people sometimes make shooting more complicated than it needs to be. If you understand the physics and take time to read the conditions carefully, very long shots become possible. It just requires patience and preparation." The response drew laughter and applause from an audience that appreciated both her accomplishment and her understated explanation of something they knew was extraordinarily difficult. On the flight home to Colorado, Sarah sat quietly with her father, processing the events of the weekend. The shooting community's reaction to her performance had been overwhelming, and she was still adjusting to the attention and praise. "How do you feel about what happened?" Miguel asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I feel like I learned something important about what's possible when you really understand the science behind what you're doing. But mostly I'm excited to keep learning and see how much further I can push myself." Miguel smiled at his daughter's response. She had achieved something that would be remembered in shooting circles for decades. But her focus remained on improvement and learning rather than on the recognition her performance had earned. Neither of them realized that Sarah's achievement would open doors to opportunities they had never imagined: college scholarships, training with Olympic coaches, and invitations to compete at the international level. The quiet girl who had been afraid of loud noises just 2 years earlier had become one of the most talked-about precision shooters in the country. But more importantly, Sarah had proven to herself that patient analysis and methodical preparation could overcome challenges that seemed impossible. It was a lesson that would serve her well in all aspects of her life. Long after her shooting career had ended and her remarkable shots had become legend among those who understood what she had accomplished in the Nevada desert,